Companies that are owned by private equity firms face unique challenges when they're going through their ERP implementations and digital transformations. And I want to talk today about what are some of the things you should be thinking about as you go through your digital transformation, particularly if you're owned by a private equity firm or if you have private equity involvement. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. I'm here with Brian Potts, the COO of Third Stage Consulting, and with Adam Cheatham, Director of Strategy and Transformation at Third Stage Consulting. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, so we're here to talk about a topic that was actually inspired by a blog you wrote, Adam, about private equity and the driving force that private equity oftentimes has in ERP implementations for companies that are owned by private equity. So I guess to start, in general, what are some of the impacts that a private equity firm has that you've seen with our clients on their organizations, and how does it affect the selection and implementation in general?
That's a great question, and one of the starting points that I usually like to begin with is that private equity is kind of like this invisible hand from behind the scenes, and they have their own motivations for a software selection and an implementation that's usually driven towards driving some type of a return, right? So knowing what that looks like and where that comes from is sometimes difficult to figure out, because every software selection and implementation is different, and every private equity firm has different exit strategies and different purposes for undergoing some type of a digital transformation. So finding out what those motivations are to start, especially early, is usually pretty important and can be difficult to nail down. And then making sure that you're aligned with those as you run through your digital transformation project is also important.
Yeah. What about you, Brian? Have you seen anything different or anything else you would add to that?
No, I mean, it's great. It's great to identify that. The trick is when it's not always clear, and for rightful reasons, it may not always be clear from a business standpoint what that underlying motivation of the PE firm is. So identifying those, be careful with making assumptions, too prematurely, and how to react to that.
Yeah, it seems like it's a spectrum of different influences a PE firm can have. I mean, we've seen some clients where the PE firm tells us, go ahead and select and implement a technology solution, but do it as quickly and cheaply as you can, because we're just going to turn around and sell the company, and the parent company's probably going to rip it out anyway. So just put in a Band-Aid, for lack of a better word, to get us through to the other side. Whereas other companies will say, no, we want to create as much business value as we can, and we know that's going to drive up the valuation. And so it's kind of it's a unique spectrum or continuum that a lot of these PE firms fall on. So there's no one way that they seem to treat it.
Yeah, the difficult part sometimes is when you've got a situation where it's a business, call it under fire, where it's been purchased probably at a great discount, and there's a lot of changes that are taking place, not just in technology, but people, processes, and
Yep.
a lot of operations are being changed. Warehouses might be being shut down. People are coming and going, and there's a lot of change and confusion. So that, combined with the digital transformation, can be difficult.
Yeah, there's a lot that happens wrapped up in all that. Like you said, not just the people side of things, internal turnover, as well as the software changes that can happen, and then not knowing where this is coming from. We just got bought by somebody, and all these changes are happening, and from the folks on the ground, it just looks like a bunch of changes that are happening that inspires quite a lot of fear. And that fear in general can manifest in a lot of negative ways with regard to change management issues and resistance throughout your implementation.
Yeah. And a lot of our clients that you guys and the rest of our team worked with, a lot of them are PE owned, or there's some sort of PE involvement, which would make sense because they're the ones that are most likely to want to go through some sort of digital transformation to increase the value of the company. But in general, when you look at those clients that we've worked with that are PE owned or partially PE owned, what are some of the influences you've seen them have on the selection or implementation process, or some examples of how they've influenced the process?
They're all different, but at the same time, the impact reveals itself eventually. I've seen some where the private equity firm is pretty heavy-handed, and they start placing new executive leadership. They'll replace the CFO, they'll replace the VP of manufacturing, or a lot of times they'll bring in their own guy who's specializes in something like production and say, it's your job to fix this, and that person becomes effectively a communication point with a private equity firm that they, for one reason or another, are focusing on a particular functional area. There are also some influences that can happen that are a little bit hard to manage sometimes when a private equity firm has a bias towards a particular software. And that's really a challenge because you find that that really reveals itself the most when you just start getting a lot of questions about that software. Why didn't you look at this one? Or why didn't this one win? Or we're going to choose this one anyway. Those types of questions, we're just going through the motions because we've got to find something and then cramming the wrong software down a small company's throat, particularly a company that's been bought at fire sale that could be possibly troubled, ends up being something that's difficult to manage through all the way to the end of an implementation.
Yeah. What are some of the, if I'm a PE guy or gal and I'm telling my portfolio company that, hey, we need to implement new technology or we want to invest in new ERP systems or digital transformation, what are some of the blind spots that I should be aware of, or some of the challenges that you've seen caused by some of that involvement, or maybe lack of understanding of what these types of projects look like? Have you seen any of that in our client experience?
The biggest thing is the question marks. What's happening and why. Getting acquired and then having all of these things happen all at once, and because private equity firms, they waste no time. Knowing what that looks like and feels like from the ground level is really the biggest impact, and the amount of uncertainty that it injects, because people fill gaps with what they think might be the scenario, and that's usually not the best case scenario that they fill gaps with. Oh, this is all well intentioned and we're all going to be fine. That's not usually how people's assumptions go, and that creates a lot of challenges from a perspective of resistance on trying to learn the processes as they need to be, as well as implementing changes that need to happen.
I think a big gap across the board when you're talking private equity, digital transformation, is the concept of organizational change management. And I think combined two forces, private equity and companies in general, it's something that is greatly misunderstood and kind of just tossed to the side. So be very, very cautious of that. Private equity comes in, let's do this quick and cheap, basically, but effective. But one of the biggest overlooked things is that people are going to have to change. People might be resisting this. So how do we manage that? How do we assess it? And how do we make awareness for it?
Yeah.
I think it's important not to get the idea, too, though, that private equity-owned selections and implementations are doomed because of this level of uncertainty, that those can become real allies. In a lot of cases, the places that I've seen the most success are when the private equity firm comes in and they say, this is what we're looking for, the objectives are clear, and they go for that, and their message is consistent. I've recently had a client that their whole goal here is that, from a private equity side of it, is to get just maximize efficiency. We're not necessarily certain whether or not that has to involve software at all, but efficiency is what we're looking for, so that our point here is that when we flip this company, we've squeezed out every last bit of fat and we're running lean. Now you go run it. It's ready for an implementation if you want it, but it doesn't necessarily need it. Or the folks that know that they've really bought a troubled company. They have a couple of points where it's clear that the private equity firm is invested in this. They're paying close attention to it. They put their best guys on it, which then creates a message within the company that we've got the best of the best here, and we're going to do this right. So that messaging that comes from the private equity firm can be quite helpful, especially when you get the type of support that you need.
Yeah, and it's a lot of the stuff we were talking about with change management and business value. I think those are two things that I picked up on that are really important. Is that we as consultants oftentimes have to try harder with private equity firms to make sure that they see the value in everything that's happening, and make sure we can translate that into not something that you should just do because we're consultants and that's what we always do, but more, how does that translate into business value for you? How does it affect the valuation of the company, of the long-term growth potential? And it really gives people, in some ways, a better sense of direction, and it makes decision-making a little bit easier when you've got that sort of clarity. If I'm a project team member or an executive at a company that's owned by a private equity firm, what are some of the things that I could do to drive alignment between my own team, my own organization, and the private equity firm?
You start with knowing what the message to be aligned with is. That always has to be the very beginning, finding out what our strategy is here and then maintaining consistency with it. I think that once you know what your message is and you create that consistency, it almost starts to breed its own sense of alignment because people begin to learn to trust it. And that's really the biggest first step, is knowing that we're all in this together and we're all headed in a positive direction that's driven by something that isn't malicious or scary. It's meant for the benefit of all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Well, thanks a lot for your time, guys. Appreciate it. This is good discussion and something that I think is of interest to a lot of organizations going through this type of transformation. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for joining. I've also included some links below to some resources that should be helpful in your transformation journey, whether you're PE owned or not. We encourage you to check out those links below. And if you like the video, please like it, and also encourage you to provide any comments you have below. We'd love to hear your feedback on what your experience has been with private equity and your experience with the overall journey. So thank you very much for your time, and hope you have a great day.